They say grief dies with time. But what if the dead refuse to let go? Tonight you'll hear stories of love twisted into something darker, where vows never end, where portraits breathe, where wedding rings burn, and where silence itself has a voice. These are not tales of passion, they are confessions of revenge. From attics that whisper in the night, to chapels where promises turn into curses. Every story will pull you deeper until you realize the wives in these tales never really left, and the husbands, they discovered too late that love is eternal, but so is vengeance. Elias Marrow hadn't set foot in the house for nearly a decade. It loomed over him now, a weathered Victorian manor tucked into the countryside, its roofline sharp against the evening sky. Once, it had been filled with laughter and paint-scented air. His wife, Clara, had loved every creaking board, every drafty corner. She'd called it their forever home. But forever had ended too soon. Clara's sudden death, a year earlier, had gutted him in ways he couldn't put into words. She was an artist, vibrant, unpredictable, a woman who painted like every brushstroke could save her from time itself. And when she was gone, Elias had sealed the house, unable to face its ghosts. Now, with the city apartments suffocating him and well-meaning friends urging him to heal, Elias returned. He told himself it was for closure, to sort through her things, to sell the place. But the truth was simpler, darker. He couldn't let go. The front door groaned when he pushed it open, stale air rushing out like a sigh. A dust filmed the windows, cobwebs stretched across the hall corners. But it still smelled faintly of turpentine and lavender, Clara's blend of paint and perfume. Home, he muttered, though the word felt wrong in his mouth. The first hours passed in ritual. He unpacked his duffel, set water to boil on the old stove, and walked room to room, reacquainting himself with their life frozen in time. The parlor still held her easel, an unfinished canvas draped with cloth. Their bedroom smelled faintly of cedar and old fabric. The garden beyond the kitchen window was wild, weeds swallowing what once had been a riot of color. Elias paused often, waiting for the sound of her voice, the light touch of her hand. Silence pressed in instead. By dusk, restless and unwilling to sleep, he climbed the narrow staircase that wound up to the attic. He hadn't been there since the funeral. The attic door stuck, wood swollen by years of rain. When it finally yielded, a gust of dust billowed out. He coughed, shining his flashlight into the gloom. The space stretched low and wide, rafters thick with spiderwebs, boxes stacked in uneven towers. Clara had loved storing her older canvases up here, keeping only her favorites downstairs. Something tugged him deeper. Past the crates of old books and trunks of clothes against the far wall stood a painting draped in white linen, larger than the others. Prominent, Elias hesitated, heart thudding. He knew Clara's handwriting on the masking tape at its base. "Do not move." Her voice echoed in memory, teasing him. "Not yet, Eli. This one's special. You'll see when it's ready." Hands trembling, he peeled the sheet away. The portrait beneath stole his breath. It was Clara, painted in oils, luminous and lifelike. She sat in a backed chair, her head tilted slightly, her gaze fixed on the viewer. Every detail was precise. The auburn strands of her hair, the freckles dusting her collarbone, the faint smile playing at her lips, yet something in the eyes made Elias shiver. They weren't warm, not like hers had been in life. They were expectant. He touched the edge of the frame, a whisper escaping him. "Clara." The attic seemed to lean in, air heavy with something unseen. A floorboard creaked behind him. Elias spun, flashlight beam cutting across the dark. Only shadows, just the house settling. Still his pulse raced. He replaced the sheet, retreating downstairs faster than he cared to admit. That night, he lay awake in the narrow bed, every groan of the timbers amplified. Memories clawed at him. Clara's laughter, her arguments, her stubborn insistence that some paintings weren't just paintings. Sleep came fitfully. When dawn finally broke, Elias rose, drawn once more to the attic. The portrait waited. Only this time, something was wrong. The sheet had slipped. The face peered out, uncovered. He hadn't left it like that. and the smile was wider. Not much, but unmistakable. Elias stumbled back, hand over his mouth. His mind raced with explanations, memory playing tricks, faulty light, his own grief twisting reality. But even as he told himself those lies, he couldn't stop staring at the brushstrokes. They were hers. Clara's hand was unmistakable. But this was no static painting. Something had changed. By midday, he'd convinced himself he'd imagined it. The sheet went back on. He busied himself in the kitchen, making coffee, cleaning surfaces, telling himself this was therapy. He read old journals of hers. Notes about color and light, sketches of unfinished ideas. But when night fell again, he heard it, faint, from above, the sound of fabric sliding across wood. The sheet. Elias froze in the darkened hallway, ears straining. Then another sound, softer, yet impossible, a whisper. It came from the attic, curling down the staircase like smoke. A single word carried on a voice he knew better than his own heartbeat. Elias. He staggered back, pressing his hands to his ears. His wife was dead. He had buried her. He had spoken at her funeral, held her cold fingers one last time. And yet the house was no longer silent. The attic had found its voice. Elias didn't sleep much after that first night. Every creak in the floorboards made him jolt. Every sigh of wind through the shutters pulled him upright in bed. By morning, his nerves were frayed, and he convinced himself he had been dreaming. Dreams were liars. Grief made the mind cruel. That was all. But when he climbed back into the attic later that day, telling himself he would put the portrait into storage, his breath caught. The sheet was gone entirely. It lay crumpled in the corner, as though tossed there in a hurry.
Vows.
And the painting, Clara's painting, was staring at him openly, defiantly. Her smile had grown again, too wide. The corners of her lips curled in a way no brushstroke should have captured. Even worse, her eyes no longer met his. They looked past him, toward the attic door, as though expecting someone else to enter. His skin prickled. He whispered her name, but the attic gave no answer, only dust and silence. With shaking hands, he threw the sheet back over the canvas, but the shape of her face beneath the linen still bulged, as if she were pressing forward to escape. That night, the whispers came louder. At first it was his name, breathy, almost tender. But then they multiplied. Dozens of voices, rising and falling, indistinct, but insistent. Some laughed softly. Others hissed words he couldn't quite catch. They slithered through the vents, crawled across the floorboards, wound their way into his dreams. He woke, drenched in sweat, the clock on the nightstand frozen at 3:12 a.m. He could swear the voices stopped the second his eyes opened, like children caught misbehaving. The next morning, he found something impossible. On the kitchen table lay a paintbrush. One of Clara's. Its bristles were damp, slick with crimson pigment. Elias frowned, lifting it to the light. The paint was wet, fresh. But all of Clara's paints had been packed away long before she died. His gaze snapped toward the ceiling, toward the attic, climbed the steps 2 at a time, dread clawing at his stomach. When he yanked the sheet down again, his knees nearly buckled. The portrait was different. The background, once blank, now showed a shadowy suggestion of the attic rafters. Behind Clara's painted figure, the outlines of boxes had appeared. It was no longer just a portrait. It was here. The attic itself was bleeding into the canvas. And Clara's hands, once folded demurely in her lap, now gripped the arms of the chair, knuckles pale. She looked as though she were straining to rise, to pull herself forward. Elias stumbled back, his chest tightening. "Stop," he muttered, voice cracking. "You're gone. You're not." The whisper cut him off. Not from the air, from the canvas. Elias. He dropped the sheet, bolted downstairs, and locked himself in the bedroom. Heart hammering like a trapped animal's. For hours, he sat with his back against the door, listening, waiting for footsteps, for the attic stairs to groan, for anything. But the house stayed still. By evening, he convinced himself it was grief again, nothing more. He opened a bottle of whiskey, poured too much into a glass, and drank until his mind softened, till the whispers dimmed. Yet even in his stupor, the painting invaded his thoughts. He saw Clara's smile, her eyes moving, her body inching closer to the edge of the chair. When he finally collapsed into sleep, the dream was worse than reality. He dreamt he stood in the attic, but the portrait was gone from its frame. Clara herself stood in its place, pale and waxy, her dress dripping with paint. She lifted her hand to him, palm slick red, and whispered, "Come with me." He woke with a scream, clawing at his sheets. His throat ached, his chest felt crushed, and outside the bedroom door, he swore he heard soft, deliberate footsteps retreating up the stairs. The next morning, Elias avoided the attic altogether. He tried the garden, pulling weeds until his hands blistered. He read one of Clara's old journals, desperate for distraction. But everywhere, her presence pressed in. At the edge of his vision, shadows shifted. Mirrors seemed to ripple, catching glimpses of her auburn hair where there was none. By nightfall, the whispers had grown bold. They no longer waited until he was half asleep. Now they coiled through the house while he sat awake, clear and insistent. "Look at me. Come upstairs. Don't leave me here alone." The voices weren't just Clara's anymore. Some were deep, masculine, guttural, almost childlike. A chorus of unseen mouths, all urging him upward. And Elias felt the pull. Against his will, his feet carried him halfway up the staircase before he caught himself, trembling, forcing his body back down. He pressed his palms to his ears, shouting, "Leave me alone." The house fell silent, but only for a heartbeat. Then came laughter. Cruel, echoing laughter that spilled from every corner of the house, shaking him to his core. The portrait wasn't just changing, it was alive. Elias knew, deep down, that Clara was still with him. But she wasn't the Clara he had loved. Something else had taken root inside that canvas, and every night it grew bolder, hungrier. And still, he couldn't bring himself to destroy it. Because in the cracks of his fear, in the trembling of his hands, was a dangerous thought. What if, just what if, it really was her? What if the whispers were his only chance to see his wife again? The attic door waited. The portrait waited. And Elias Merrill was already unraveling. Elias had stopped laughing at himself by the third week. What began as silly coincidences like the portrait's shifting expressions had now grown into something undeniable. Every morning, the attic greeted him with a new detail. Margaret's eyes seemed sharper. Her lips parted as if she were on the verge of speaking. Her hands, once gently folded in her lap, now reaching outward, closer to the frame's edge. He tried ignoring it, but the changes bled into the house itself. One morning, he found the kitchen chair pulled back from the table, as though someone had just risen from breakfast. Another evening, the scent of Margaret's favorite perfume, a lavender blend he had sealed away months ago, drifted down the staircase and lingered in the hallway. The worst came on a rain-soaked Wednesday. Elias returned from town, boots muddy, only to find the attic door ajar. He froze halfway up the stairs. He had locked it that morning. With trembling hands, he pushed it open. The portrait loomed in its usual place, but something new marred the canvas. Faint, pale strokes that hadn't been there before. Letters, words. He stepped closer, heart hammering, and saw the beginnings of a sentence scratched in shaky brushwork. Saint the rest trailed off, incomplete, like a hand pulled suddenly from the canvas. Elias stumbled back, knocking over an old lamp. The attic air grew colder, pressing in around him, heavy with a static buzz that raised the hairs on his neck. That night, sleep abandoned him. He tossed in bed, Margaret's name on his lips like a prayer. At 2:17 a.m., a sharp knock echoed from upstairs. Not the creak of settling wood, not the wind, 3 deliberate knocks. Elias lay frozen, staring at the ceiling. Then, faint but clear, came the sound of chalk scraping across a board. Only there was no chalkboard in the house. Mustering courage, he crept up the staircase, candles shaking in his hand. The attic door stood shut, pressed his ear to the wood. Silence. Gathering what little bravery remained, he pushed it open. The portrait's eyes glistened in the candlelight, almost wet, almost alive. Below it, on the dusty floorboards, were 3 objects arranged neatly in a row. Margaret's wedding ring, his old fountain pen, and a crumpled photograph of them from their honeymoon. He hadn't seen that photograph in years. It had been packed away in a sealed trunk. He whispered her name. The candle flame flickered wildly, then extinguished, plunging him into total blackness. In that silence, something moved. A soft shuffle behind him as though bare feet brushed the floor. His breath caught in his throat. He bolted, slamming the attic door, racing downstairs, refusing to look back. By morning, his rational mind tried to rebuild walls. Perhaps he had left the trunk open, misplaced the ring, forgotten the pen. But deep down, he knew these weren't mistakes. They were messages. Over the next days, they multiplied. His typewriter clacked late at night, producing half-written sentences. "Still here, don't forget. Finish what you..." Cups rattled across the counter when he entered the kitchen. Once he found E carved faintly into the condensation on the bathroom mirror, though he hadn't drawn a bath. Elias grew gaunt, shadows etching his face. Each night he swore he heard Margaret's voice, sometimes a whisper in the hall, sometimes a sob drifting through the walls, sometimes his name carried on the wind like a plea. On Friday, something changed. He climbed to the attic and found the portrait glowing faintly, as if catching moonlight where none shone. The half-written word now read clear. "Stop." His hands trembled. "Stop what?" he asked the empty air. The silence pressed in. Then behind him, the floor groaned. He spun, and there in the dim attic, objects began to stir on their own. The old rocking chair creaked forward and back. The lamp he had toppled days ago stood upright, bulb flickering though unplugged. The photograph lifted from the floor, hovered, and fluttered back onto the chest with eerie precision. And through it all, the portrait watched, Margaret's painted hand now fully extended. Fingers brushing against the invisible barrier of the frame, Elias dropped to his knees, clutching his head. "What do you want from me?" he begged. His voice cracked, breaking the silence. The attic answered. Not with words, but with sound, the unmistakable thump of footsteps pacing above the rafters. Though he was already at the top of the house, heavy, slow, deliberate, circling, he couldn't bear it. He fled once more, slamming the door, locking it, dragging a chair against it. Even downstairs, even under blankets, even with ears pressed shut. He could hear the faint rhythm of footsteps and the echo of Margaret's voice whispering his name, promising she had not left. The painting had become more than a memory. It was now a door. And whatever Margaret wanted, Elias feared the message wasn't a plea for love. It was a warning. Or a revenge. Elias hadn't slept for 3 nights. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands shaking, his voice raw from whispering prayers to an empty house. The rules of the world he knew had dissolved. The portrait upstairs wasn't just shifting, it was becoming. That evening the storm rolled in without warning. Rain lashed against the windows. Wind howled like 1,000 voices. And thunder cracked so violently the glass panes shuddered. Elias sat rigid at the dining table, a candle guttering before him. He had locked the attic door, nailed it shut, even pushed furniture against it. Still, he knew it wouldn't hold. Because tonight, she wanted out. The candle flickered, then extinguished, leaving him in smothering darkness. Somewhere above would groan first softly, then violently, as though heavy hands pressed against the attic walls. Then, unmistakably, came the sound of the lock snapping. Elias rose, heart hammering. "Margaret," he whispered into the storm, voice trembling. "Please, whatever you are now, please let me go." The house answered with silence. Then, a slow, deliberate sound. The attic door creaking open. He stumbled backward as footsteps descended the stairs. They weren't heavy like a man's, nor light like a child's. They were uneven, dragging, as though something half-formed struggled with each step. The air grew colder, his breath visible in pale clouds. The footsteps stopped halfway down, and then he heard her voice. Elias. It wasn't the warm voice he remembered. This one was layered, fractured, as though spoken from inside a cavern. He froze, staring into the shadows. Slowly, his candle sputtered back to life, and there it was. The portrait. Not hanging in the attic anymore, but propped against the banister halfway down the stairs. The frame seemed to pulse, the canvas shimmering, as if wet. Margaret's painted face stared at him with impossible intensity. Her hand pressed flat against the inside of the frame, fingers curling as if testing the barrier. Elias's knees buckled. No, this isn't real. The hand pushed again. This time, the canvas stretched outward, like fabric straining around a fist. With a wet, tearing sound, painted fingers broke through, clutching the wooden banister. Elias screamed and staggered back. The portrait slid further down the stairs on its own, each thud of the frame echoing like a coffin lid closing. Margaret's painted arm stretched longer, dragging itself out, elbow bending where no paint should bend. Elias. The voice was clearer now, closer, dripping with grief and venom. The candle blew out again. Out. Darkness swallowed everything but the faint, unnatural glow of the portrait as Margaret's half-painted body writhed from the frame. Her face, no longer just brushstrokes, was forming in front of his eyes, skin pale, eyes hollow, mouth opening wider than it ever had in life. He stumbled into the parlor, knocking over chairs, tripping over rugs. "Please, Margaret, I loved you. I still love you." The portrait crashed onto the floor, landing upright, impossibly balanced. From within, she pulled herself free up to the waist, now paint dripping from her body like blood, pooling black across the floorboards. Her hair, once golden in the canvas, now streamed in sticky strands. "You left me," she hissed, voice layered with thunder. "You let me die, and then you tried to forget." Elias collapsed against the wall, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't forget. I can't. That's why you're still here." For a heartbeat. Silence. Then, the unfinished word on the painting flashed in his mind. Stop. Not a warning for her. A warning for him. Margaret's figure crawled fully from the frame, dragging itself across the floor toward him. Body was wrong paint and flesh fused together, limbs bending too far, fingers smearing oily streaks across the wood. Her face hovered inches from his, eyes filled with rage and sorrow. He reached for the fireplace poker, swinging wildly. Struck her shoulder, splattering paint across the wall, but she only laughed, hollow, broken sound. "Shh. You will never leave me again." The last thing Elias saw was the portrait. Emptied its canvas, a void of swirling black. Margaret pulled him toward it, his body sinking into the frame as though dragged underwater. He screamed, thrashing, but the house drowned his cries beneath the roar of thunder. His body vanished into the canvas, swallowed whole. Then, silence. The storm passed. The house stood still, calm once more. The portrait returned to the attic, resting in its place, as if it had never moved. Margaret sat within it again, expression serene, a faint smile on her lips. But now, beside her chair, a new figure appeared in paint. Elias's face pale, eyes wide with terror, trapped forever at her side. Days later, neighbors claimed they saw a faint light flicker in the attic window. Others swore they heard whispers drifting through the night air, voices of a man and a woman, overlapping, inseparable. The portrait was never moved again. The house, though sold many times over, always returned to silence, because those who lived there didn't stay long. They said the painting had eyes that followed you. If you stared too long, you might swear you heard a whisper. Come join us. The church bells had barely stopped tolling when Daniel slipped the ring from his pocket. It was small, delicate platinum band with a single diamond that caught the sunlight like a tear. He clenched it so tightly his knuckles blanched, as if holding it any longer might burn him. The mourners had already gone. Only the caretaker lingered by the iron gates, waiting to lock up for the evening. Rows of gravestones stood like silent witnesses, and freshly turned soil marked where Elizabeth now lay, Daniel's wife, his partner of 9 years. His judge, though she would never speak again. He stared down at the band, jaw clenched. "I can't keep this," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. His hand trembled. I won't." In a single motion, he hurled the ring into the thicket beyond the cemetery fence. It vanished into the brush with a faint metallic snap. A relief rushed through him, a strange exhilaration. For the first time since her death, he felt lighter. The weight of her memory, the weight of her eyes lifted, if only slightly. He walked home beneath a sky bruised with dusk. His footsteps echoed hollowly on the empty pavement, each step taking him further from the grave, further from her. The house felt cavernous without Elizabeth's presence. Every corner seemed swollen with silence. The walls no longer humming with her laughter or her music drifting from the old record player. He poured himself a drink scotch, Nitan sat at the dining table, staring at the single place setting left untouched since the day of the funeral. Hours later, after exhaustion claimed him, he stumbled into the bedroom. Her side of the bed remained perfectly made. He collapsed on his own side, clothes still clinging to him. Sleep took him fast. But when morning arrived, Daniel woke to something impossible. There on the nightstand beside his head gleamed Elizabeth's ring. His breath caught. He sat upright, blinking hard, certain it was a dream. But no. The platinum band caught the dawn light just as it had in the cemetery. It rested neatly atop his phone, exactly as if someone had placed it there. His hand shook as he picked it up. Cold, too cold. His stomach twisted. He muttered, "No, I threw you away. I threw you away." He hurled it across the room, struck the dresser with a dull clink, and rolled beneath the bed. He left it there. That day at work he couldn't focus. Numbers blurred on his computer screen. His colleagues' voices drowned beneath the echo of that metallic clink. Every time he blinked, he pictured Elizabeth's pale hand, the way it had looked in the casket, skin waxy and stiff, ring finger bare. He had made sure of that. By the time he returned home, the sun was low. He dropped his briefcase, loosened his tie, and slumped into the armchair. He poured another drink, then another, each one failing to soothe the gnawing dread in his chest. Finally, he dragged himself to bed, told himself the ring was still under there, untouched. But as he pulled back the covers, his breath froze in his throat. The ring sat neatly on his pillow. Daniel stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rug. His pulse hammered in his ears. He snatched the ring, his hand trembling so violently he nearly dropped it, and ran barefoot into the yard. The night was heavy, a wet summer air clinging to his skin. Crickets chirped faintly, oblivious. He sprinted to the garden shed, flung the door open, and snatched a hammer from the shelf. Placing the ring on the stone path, he raised the hammer high and brought it down with all his weight. Clang! He struck again and again. Sparks leapt. Metal shrieked against stone. By the 10th blow, sweat soaked his shirt. His chest heaved. Finally, he lowered the hammer. The ring lay perfectly whole. Not a scratch. Daniel's knees gave out. He sat in the dirt, gasping, staring at the impossible little band. And then he heard it. A laugh. Faint. Feminine. It came not from the house, not from the woods, but from directly behind him. He spun, hammer raised. Nothing but darkness and the whisper of leaves. Shaking, he scooped up the ring and sprinted inside, locking the door, double-checking every latch and bolt. He collapsed against the wall, clutching the band so tightly it dug into his palm. In the quiet of the house, the laugh lingered. Not outside this time. Inside. His grip loosened. He dropped the ring onto the floorboards, watching as it rolled across the room and came to rest at the base of Elizabeth's chair, the one she always sat in by the window. For the rest of the night, Daniel sat frozen in the armchair opposite, unable to look away. The ring caught the moonlight in its diamond face, gleaming like an unblinking eye. And though the house was silent, Daniel swore he could hear her whispering his name. Daniel didn't sleep the night the ring rolled to Elizabeth's chair. He sat frozen, his eyes never leaving the glint of metal in the moonlight. Every time he blinked, he swore the shadows in the room shifted. They stretched too far, bending unnaturally, as if something unseen moved just beyond his vision. When dawn finally broke, he was hollow-eyed and shaking. He stood slowly, his joints stiff, and glanced at the chair. The ring was gone. For a moment, relief surged through him, until he noticed the faint indentation on the cushion, as though someone had been sitting there all night. He left the house without breakfast, without even changing clothes. He couldn't stand another minute in those walls. But as he drove to the office, his mind was nowhere near the road. It was in the bedroom, the chair, the whispers. By the time he stumbled into his cubicle, his co-workers were already giving him sideways glances at his wrinkled shirt, the dark circles beneath his eyes. He ignored them, staring at the monitor while his fingers hovered uselessly above the keyboard. All day he kept hearing footsteps. Soft, deliberate, not from the hallways but right behind him. Each time he turned, no one was there. When his boss finally pulled him aside, voice sharp with annoyance, Daniel could barely register the words. All he could think about was going home, facing the house again. That evening, the air outside was heavy with rain. Thunder rolled across the horizon. Daniel paused at the front door, keys trembling in his hand. A part of him considered getting back into the car, driving anywhere else. But exhaustion dragged him forward. The moment he entered, he froze. The ring was back, sitting on the entryway table, gleaming in the dim light, as though it had been waiting for him. "No," Daniel whispered. His throat tightened. "What do you want from me?" The silence pressed in around him. The storm outside pounded against the windows, the wind howling like a chorus of unseen voices. That night, sleep did not come easily. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the ring on the nightstand once more. His eyes burned from fatigue, but he didn't dare close them. And then he heard it. Step. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, a heel pressing softly against the floorboards just outside the bedroom door. Daniel's breath hitched. He sat up slowly, pulse hammering in his ears. Step, step. The footsteps moved closer, dragging slightly, as though whoever or whatever walked was in no hurry. The doorknob rattled. Daniel lunged for the lamp and flicked it on. Footsteps stopped. The hall was empty. He stared for a long moment before finally collapsing back into bed, his chest heaving. He left the light on until dawn, but the footsteps didn't stop there. Every night that followed, they grew bolder. Sometimes they circled the bed. Sometimes they ascended the stairs, slow and deliberate, each creak of the wood echoing in the stillness. Sometimes he heard them pacing just outside his locked door, stopping only when he whispered her name. Elizabeth. One night he awoke to the sound of breathing. Not his own, not a dream, a slow, steady exhale right beside his ear. He bolted upright, swinging wildly at empty air. The room was silent again except for the soft clink of the ring, now resting against his pillow. Daniel was unraveling. At work he could no longer hide it. His hand shook so badly he spilled coffee across the break room counter. His manager pulled him aside again, voice tight with frustration, but Daniel barely heard him. All he could hear was that faint phantom breathing, echoing in the back of his skull. That night, he devised a plan. Grabbed the ring with a rag. He refused to touch it, barehanded anymore. Drove to the old bridge outside town. Rain lashed against the windshield, the wipers groaning with effort. He parked halfway across and climbed out, the river raging below. "Stay there," he muttered, clutching the band tightly. His knuckles turned white. "Stay where you belong," he hurled the ring into the current. It vanished into the churning black water. For the first time in weeks, relief washed over him. He even laughed, a dry broken sound. He drove home, convinced it was finally over. But the house was waiting. When he stepped through the door, his laughter died in his throat. The ring sat on the coffee table, still wet, droplets of river water staining the wood. Daniel staggered back, bile rising in his throat, his vision blurred. He stumbled to the chair and collapsed, head in his hands. That was when the footsteps began again, slow, deliberate, descending the staircase. But this time, they didn't stop outside the bedroom. They kept moving, down the hall, across the living room, right toward him. Daniel raised his head just as the shadows lengthened along the wall. The storm outside flashed lightning through the windows, illuminating a silhouette. A woman's figure, distorted and wavering, her outline black against the pale light. He couldn't breathe. His heart stuttered. The figure stepped closer. The air grew icy, his breath turning to fog in the dim light. "Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice cracked. "Please, what do you want from me?" The only answer was the sound of the ring scraping across the table as it slid toward him in its own. Daniel didn't sleep the night the ring rolled to Elizabeth's chair. He sat frozen, his eyes never leaving the glint of metal in the moonlight. Every time he blinked, he swore the shadows in the room shifted. They stretched too far, bending unnaturally, as if something unseen moved just beyond his vision. When dawn finally broke, he was hollow-eyed and shaking. He stood slowly, his joints stiff, and glanced at the chair. The ring was gone. For a moment, relief surged through him, until he noticed the faint indentation on the cushion, as though someone had been sitting there all night. He left the house without breakfast, without even changing clothes. He couldn't stand another minute in those walls. But as he drove to the office, his mind was nowhere near the road. It was in the bedroom, the chair, the whispers. By the time he stumbled into his cubicle, his co-workers were already giving him looks, sideways glances at his wrinkled shirt, the dark circles beneath his eyes. He ignored them. staring at the monitor while his fingers hovered uselessly above the keyboard. All day he kept hearing footsteps. Soft, deliberate, not from the hallways but right behind him. Each time he turned, no one was there. When his boss finally pulled him aside, voice sharp with annoyance, Daniel could barely register the words. All he could think about was going home, facing the house again. That evening, the air outside was heavy with rain. Thunder rolled across the horizon. Daniel paused at the front door, keys trembling in his hand. A part of him considered getting back into the car, driving anywhere else. But exhaustion dragged him forward. The moment he entered, he froze. The ring was back, sitting on the entryway table, gleaming in the dim light. As though it had been waiting for him. No, Daniel whispered. His throat tightened. What do you want from me? The silence pressed in around him. The storm outside pounded against the windows, the wind howling like a chorus of unseen voices. That night, sleep did not come easily. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the ring on the nightstand once more. His eyes burned from fatigue, but he didn't dare close them. And then he heard it. Step. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, a heel pressing softly against the floorboards just outside the bedroom door. Daniel's breath hitched. He sat up slowly, pulse hammering in his ears. Step, step. The footsteps moved closer, dragging slightly, as though whoever or whatever walked was in no hurry. The doorknob rattled. Daniel lunged for the lamp and flicked it on. Footsteps stopped. The hall was empty. He stared for a long moment before finally collapsing back into bed, his chest heaving. He left the light on until dawn, but the footsteps didn't stop there. Every night that followed, they grew bolder. Sometimes they circled the bed. Sometimes they ascended the stairs, slow and deliberate, each creak of the wood echoing in the stillness. Sometimes he heard them pacing just outside his locked door, stopping only when he whispered her name. Elizabeth. One night he awoke to the sound of breathing. Not his own, not a dream, a slow, steady exhale right beside his ear. He bolted upright, swinging wildly at empty air. The room was silent again except for the soft clink of the ring, now resting against his pillow. Daniel was unraveling. At work he could no longer hide it. His hand shook so badly he spilled coffee across the break room counter. His manager pulled him aside again, voice tight with frustration, but Daniel barely heard him. All he could hear was that faint phantom breathing, echoing in the back of his skull. That night, he devised a plan. Grabbed the ring with a rag, he refused to touch it, barehanded anymore. Drove to the old bridge outside town. Rain lashed against the windshield, the wipers groaning with effort. He parked halfway across and climbed out, the river raging below. Stay there, he muttered, clutching the band tightly. His knuckles turned white. Stay where you belong, he hurled the ring into the current. It vanished into the churning black water. For the first time in weeks, relief washed over him. He even laughed, a dry broken sound. He drove home, convinced it was finally over. But the house was waiting. When he stepped through the door, his laughter died in his throat. The ring sat on the coffee table, still wet, droplets of river water staining the wood. Daniel staggered back, bile rising in his throat, his vision blurred. He stumbled to the chair and collapsed, head in his hands. That was when the footsteps began again, slow, deliberate, descending the staircase. But this time, they didn't stop outside the bedroom. They kept moving, down the hall, across the living room, right toward him. Daniel raised his head just as the shadows lengthened along the wall. The storm outside flashed lightning through the windows, illuminating a silhouette. A woman's figure, distorted and wavering, her outline black against the pale light. He couldn't breathe. His heart stuttered. The figure stepped closer. The air grew icy, his breath turning to fog in the dim light. Elizabeth, he whispered, his voice cracked. Please, what do you want from me? The only answer was the sound of the ring scraping across the table as it slid toward him in its own. The darkness inside the house was absolute. Not the kind that comes when you switch off the lights, but the kind that swallows even the memory of light. Daniel stood trembling in the void, his breath rasping, the ring digging into his flesh like a blade. When the lights flickered back on, the house was no longer the same. The wallpaper had peeled, curling like dead skin. Black mold spread in jagged patterns across the ceiling. The photos of Elizabeth, once neatly hung in the hallway, now all faced him. Every frame showed her expression twisted. Eyes darkened, lips curled into a grotesque smile that hadn't been there before. Daniel stumbled backward, heart hammering, but the walls themselves seemed to lean closer, the air thick with rot. "Elizabeth," he whispered, voice breaking. "Please, please let me go." The house groaned in answer. And then the footsteps began again, slow, deliberate, pacing across the upstairs hallway. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. Daniel clutched his burning hand to his chest, shaking violently. The ring pulsed with every footfall, the heat sinking with the rhythm, branding his flesh deeper. Then came her voice, low, clear. No longer whispers, no longer fleeting. "You will never take it off." He spun. She was there at the top of the stairs. Elizabeth. But not the woman he had buried. Her skin was pallid, veins black and twisting beneath the surface. Her wedding dress, the same one she'd have been buried in, clung to her like wet cloth mottled with earth. Her eyes glowed faintly, pale and endless. And on her hand, the twin of the ring he now wore. Daniel collapsed to his knees. Tears streaked his face. "I'm sorry," he pleaded. "I told you the truth. Isn't that enough?" Her head tilted, unnatural, like a marionette's. "Enough." Her voice cracked the air like thunder. "You vowed before God. You vowed to me. You spat on it. I didn't mean to." The ring seared hotter, cutting off his words. Smoke curled from his blistered hand. Elizabeth descended the stairs without moving her feet. She drifted, her gown dragging noiselessly along the wood. With each step closer, the shadows bent toward her, drawn like iron filings to a magnet. "You think the grave frees you?" she hissed. "You think betrayal dies with the body?" Daniel tried to crawl away, scrambling into the living room, but every door slammed shut at once. The windows fogged, thick condensation dripping like sweat. Elizabeth's form blurred, stretched, filling the room. Her voice reverberated in his skull. "You will carry me. You will wear me. You will remember me until your last breath." The ring flared white-hot. Daniel screamed until his throat tore, falling onto the floor, clutching his hand as it fused into his flesh. His skin charred, the metal embedding deeper, merging with bone. He blacked out. When he awoke, it was morning. Sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains. For a brief, fragile moment, he thought it had been a nightmare, until he looked at his hand. The ring was gone, not vanished, absorbed. His finger was now a perfect circle of scar tissue, smooth, gleaming like metal. It pulsed faintly as if a second heart beat inside it. Daniel staggered to his feet, gagging. He stumbled into the bathroom and stared into the mirror. His reflection stared back, gaunt, hollow-eyed. And then Elizabeth's face flickered over his own, smiling through his features. He smashed the mirror, but every shard showed the same thing. Her, inside him. The haunting never stopped after that. Wherever he went, the ring scar burned. In crowds, he heard her whispering in his ear. In sleep, she appeared beside him in the bed, her cold fingers entwined with his. He could not eat without tasting the soil of her grave. He could not close his eyes without hearing the vows he had broken, repeated in her voice, louder and louder. "I take you, till death do us part." The words mocked him, etched into every moment of his waking life. His friends noticed his decline. Daniel stopped, leaving the house, stopped working, stopped speaking. When they came to check on him, he refused to open the door. And when they peered through the window, they swore they saw someone standing behind him, a pale woman in a wedding gown, hand resting possessively on his shoulder. Weeks bled into months. Daniel wasted away, hollowed out by the constant torment. His blistered hand rotted slowly, the skin black and dead, but the ring scar pulsed stronger, binding him. One night, desperate, he tried to cut it off. He brought the blade down hard against his finger, but the knife shattered, splintering into useless shards. The ring scar remained untouched, mocking. Elizabeth's laughter filled the house that night. By the time the neighbors called the police for the smell, it was too late. They found Daniel's body slumped in the corner of the living room, his face twisted in a frozen scream. His hand, the one bound by the ring scar, was clenched tight against his chest, skin fused to bone. But what unsettled them most was the detail no one could explain. On his finger, perfectly intact, gleamed a wedding band. Though Daniel's body was cold, the ring was warm to the touch. David and Laura had been married for nearly 10 years. When they finally found the house they both thought could be their forever home. It wasn't new. In fact, it was nearly a century old. But Laura had always dreamed of a place with history. The realtor described it as full of charm and character. The locals called it the Ashcroft Place. A looming Victorian with tall windows and steep gables that cast jagged shadows across the lawn at dusk. The house was priced suspiciously low for its size, but David was eager to put roots down. They signed the papers within a week. The first few days were everything Laura had imagined. She filled the parlor with antique furniture, embroidered lace curtains, and porcelain lamps. She laughed at how the floorboards groaned with every step, saying it made the house talk. But the house had one secret, and Laura found it the moment they moved in. At the end of the upstairs hallway stood a door. It was different from the others. Darker wood, a heavier handle, and no key. When she twisted the knob, it didn't budge. Laura said, frowning. David jiggled it himself. No luck. Probably just a utility room or old storage. We'll get a locksmith later. But Laura lingered. Her hand rested on the knob longer than it should have, as if she was listening. That night, while unpacking, she brought it up again. Isn't it strange? Why would the previous owners leave one door locked? What if there's something important in there? David chuckled. Important? Like what? Treasure? Her smile was faint, distracted, or secrets. At first it was just curiosity. Whenever she passed the door, she'd stop for a second too long. She tapped it once or twice, pressing her ear to the wood as though she might hear the room breathing. On the third day, David found her crouched by the base of the door with a flashlight. What are you doing? Look, she whispered, shining the beam under the small gap. Dust swirled like fine ash, but beyond that, nothing but black. Doesn't it feel strange, like it's watching us? David shook his head. It's a locked room in an old house, Laura, that's all. But Laura wasn't convinced. By the end of the week, she had called to locksmiths. Both examined the door, frowned, and admitted they couldn't help. The lock's not like anything I've seen, one muttered. Old, handcrafted. You'd need the original key. When Laura asked if they could break it open, the second locksmith grew uneasy. You could, but I wouldn't. Houses like this, sometimes doors are better left shut. He refused to touch it again. David tried to laugh it off, but that night, Laura brought it up while they were in bed. Her voice was low, urgent. Don't you feel it? The way the air changes in that hallway? Every time I walk by that door, I feel like something's pulling me toward it. David reached for her hand. Laura, it's just an old room, probably full of mold and dust. She stared at the ceiling. Then why won't it let us in? In the following days, her fascination grew. She'd pause in the hallway, fingers brushing the knob as though it might suddenly turn. She left glasses of water by the door, muttering that if something's inside, baby, it's thirsty. The house itself seemed to shift with her obsession. The nights grew colder, drafts curling from beneath the locked door. Laura swore she heard faint scratching sometimes, soft and rhythmic, as though something on the other side was trying to claw its way out. One evening, as David sat reading in the living room, Laura descended the stairs, pale and trembling. It spoke, she whispered. David set his book down. What, the door? No. I heard something from inside, a whisper. It said my name. David searched her face, but there was no trace of humor. She truly believed it. From that night on, Laura changed. She began spending hours in the upstairs hallway, sitting across from the door with her knees pulled to her chest. Sometimes she hummed softly, almost like she was trying to soothe a child. Her appetite faded. Dark circles bloomed under her eyes. When David begged her to stop, she snapped at him, saying he didn't understand. By the end of the second week, she was hardly herself. The vibrant, laughing woman who had once filled their new home with warmth was now gaunt, withdrawn, her thoughts fixed on that one door. One night, David woke to find her missing from bed. Panicked, he searched the house and found her upstairs, sitting in front of the locked room, whispering to it. Her lips moved quickly, words spilling like secrets. "Laura," he shouted. She turned slowly, her face pale in the moonlight. "He's waiting," she said. "He wants me to open it." David grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently. "There's nothing in there. Stop this before you drive yourself mad." But her eyes said she already was. That night, for the first time, David wondered if buying this house had been a mistake. And deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house hadn't chosen them by accident. The house began to change in ways David could no longer ignore. At first, it was the noises. They were subtle, easy enough to dismiss as the natural groans of an old Victorian settling into its foundations. A creak here, a faint thud there. But soon the sounds gathered a rhythm, a purpose. Most of them came from upstairs, from behind the locked door. At night, David would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, while faint scratching reached his ears. It was soft at first, like the brushing of fingernails along wood. Then it grew louder, clawing as though something inside was desperate to carve its way out. Laura insisted it was calling to her. One night as the clock struck 3, she sat bolt upright in bed. "Do you hear it?" David didn't want to answer. He'd been awake pretending to sleep when the noise began. A scraping, followed by a long dragging sound, like furniture being pushed across a floor. "It's just rats," he muttered, though even as he said it, he knew how wrong it sounded. No rat moved furniture. No rat whispered through wood, because sometimes, late at night, the scratching turned into murmurs. Words too faint to understand, but words nonetheless. Laura leaned toward him, her face pale and feverish. "It says my name." David tried to pull her back down, but she fought him off, rushing into the hallway barefoot. He chased after her and found her kneeling before the locked door, pressing her ear against it like a lover desperate for a secret. "It wants me," she murmured. "It's been waiting." He dragged her away, but she struggled, her fingernails clawing at the wood as though she might dig her way in herself. After that night, things worsened. Noises became constant. Scratching, thumping, dragging, sometimes even faint tapping that followed David from room to room. And Laura began to wither. Her once rosy cheeks lost their color, leaving her skin a sickly gray. Her hair grew brittle, her eyes ringed with darkness. She hardly ate, nibbling at bread or sipping water as though her hunger was being fed elsewhere. Doctors came and went, baffled. They found no fever, no infection. Nothing physical explained her decline. "It's the house," David whispered to himself one night. "It's draining her." But when he tried to convince her to leave, Laura laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that chilled him more than the scratching behind the door. "Leave," she said. "I can't. He won't let me." "Who?" David demanded. Her lips trembled. "The one inside?" David's hands shook. He grabbed her by the shoulders, desperate to pull her back to him. "There is no one inside. It's an empty room." But her eyes flicked toward the locked door, glowing with something he had never seen in her before, something both terrified and devoted. As the weeks passed, her health worsened. She began coughing at night, deep, racking coughs that left specks of blood on her handkerchief. Her body grew frail, but her obsession only grew stronger. One evening, David returned from work to find her collapsed outside the locked door. Her head rested against the wood, lips moving soundlessly, as though she were speaking directly to whatever lay inside. He carried her to bed, her body frighteningly light in his arms. That night, he resolved to end this madness. With hammer in hand, he marched upstairs. If the door wouldn't open with a key, he would break it down. But as he raised the hammer, something stopped him. The air in the hallway thickened, pressing against his chest. The temperature dropped so suddenly that his breath fogged in front of his face. The scratching started again, but this time, it wasn't faint. It was furious, violent, clawing at the door with such force that dust shook from the frame. And then, clear as day, a whisper slithered through the wood. "Don't." David froze. His heart pounded, his arm trembling, as the hammer slipped from his grip and clattered to the floor. Laura's weak voice came from the bedroom, carried down the hall. "He doesn't want you, he only wants me." David stood there in the dark, paralyzed. The sound of his wife's coughing mingling with the furious scratching. From that night forward, he stopped trying to fight it. He stayed at her bedside, helpless, watching her waste away day by day. And every night, the noises grew louder. Every night, the locked door seemed closer to opening itself. Laura died on a Tuesday. There was no warning, no final decline. One moment, she was lying in bed, her frail body trembling as she whispered feverishly to the ceiling, lips moving as though answering invisible questions. The next, her chest rose sharply, and then fell still. David was at her side, clutching her hand, when the color drained from her face. "Laura," he gasped, shaking her gently. "Laura, stay with me." But she was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. For weeks, the house had been filled with noises, scratching, dragging, the whispers behind the door. Now there was nothing. David sat there for hours, numb, holding her hand until it grew cold. He didn't call anyone right away. He didn't know how. What words could explain the way she had wasted away, as though something inside those walls had fed on her? When he finally called, the doctors wrote it off as sudden heart failure, perhaps worsened by her declining health. The funeral was small, quiet. David stood at the grave, staring at the coffin as it disappeared into the ground, wondering if burying her would truly lay her to rest, or if part of her had never left the house at all. When he returned home, the silence felt suffocating. He moved through the rooms mechanically, cleaning, folding, doing anything to avoid looking at the staircase that led to the locked door. But his eyes betrayed him, flicking upward again and again. For the first time since Laura's obsession began, the house felt patient. That night, David fell into a restless sleep on the couch. His dreams were filled with Laura, her eyes sunken, her lips whispering words he couldn't hear. She stood at the top of the stairs in the dream, her thin hand resting on the knob of the locked door. When he awoke, his chest was heavy with dread. And then he realized something. The house was no longer silent. The scratching was back. But it wasn't coming from behind the door. It was coming from inside the walls. David pressed his ear against the plaster. Something moved just beyond, slow, deliberate. It slithered along the wooden beams, scraping softly as if circling him. By the time the clock struck midnight, he heard a click. His blood turned to ice. He looked up the staircase. The locked door was ajar. The padlock he had hammered into place weeks ago, broken, lying on the floor like it had been sliced through with something sharper than metal. David's legs carried him upward against his will. The door gaped open just enough to reveal blackness beyond. No moonlight reached inside. It was an absence of light so complete, it felt alive. He hovered in the hallway, heart pounding in his ears. Something moved in that darkness. It was faint, a shift, a shadow, a figure stepping just beyond sight. And then he heard her voice. David. His wife's voice. It was soft, breathless, almost tender. He staggered backward, shaking his head. "Oh no, you're gone." But the whisper came again, stronger, edged with a hunger that froze his veins. "Come in." He slammed the door shut and stumbled back down the stairs, nearly tripping over himself. But when he looked back, the door was open again, wider this time. That night he didn't sleep. He sat in the living room with every lamp burning, clutching a kitchen knife, listening to the house breathe. At 3 a.m, the scratching returned, not faint anymore, but furious, everywhere at once. The walls shook, the floorboards groaned, the ceiling pulsed with the sound. And then, above him, he heard footsteps. Slow, measured, crossing the hall, entering the room. Something was inside now. The next day, he tried to convince himself it was grief, exhaustion, paranoia. He walked through the house, sunlight spilling through the windows, trying to see it as just wood and plaster. But when he reached the top of the stairs, the door was wide open. For the first time since moving in, he saw inside. The room was bare. No furniture, no carpet, no windows. Just rotting wood, peeling wallpaper, and the portrait. Laura's portrait. It wasn't possible. He'd never seen it before. Never watched her paint it. Never found it in storage. Yet there it hung on the wall, massive and wrong. Her face was there, but distorted. Her eyes too wide, her mouth twisted in something between a smile and a scream. And the longer David looked, the more it seemed to move. Her eyes blinked, her lips curled. And then her voice. Not from his memory, not from the grave, but from the canvas itself. "David, I told you not to leave me." He staggered backward, nearly falling down the stairs. The door slammed shut on its own, rattling the walls. For hours he sat downstairs, trembling, staring at the ceiling. Laura was gone, but something else wasn't. The room had been waiting. And now it was open. David avoided the upstairs for as long as he could. He slept on the couch, ate in silence, and moved through the house like a man trapped in a cage. Every night, the whispers returned. Sometimes it was scratching, sometimes it was footsteps, sometimes it was Laura's voice calling his name. Da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. But the worst nights were when the house went completely silent. Those nights, he knew something was watching. 3 nights after the door first opened on its own, David broke. Couldn't take the waiting anymore. Couldn't he take the tension of knowing there was a room in his house that pulsed with a hunger couldn't he understand? If it wanted him, he thought, maybe it was better to end it now rather than live in endless dread. He climbed the staircase. Each step groaned beneath his weight, as though warning him to turn back. The door was open, waiting. Inside, the air was heavy and damp, like breathing in soil after rain. The portrait still hung on the wall. Tonight, Laura's painted eyes followed him, sharp and alive. He stepped in. The door slammed shut behind him. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness, and slowly his eyes adjusted. She was standing in the corner. Laura, not painted, not imagined, but whole. Her figure pale and translucent, like smoke wrapped in flesh. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her white nightgown clung to her thin frame. "Laura," David whispered, tears stinging his eyes. "It's really you." Her head tilted slowly, unnaturally. The smile that crept across her face was too wide, stretching her skin in ways it shouldn't. "You left me," she said softly. Her voice was layered. His wife's tone, but beneath it, something deeper, darker, ancient. David's throat tightened. "I didn't. I couldn't save you. You just..." Her laugh cut him off. A hollow sound, sharp and broken. "You always looked past me, even when I begged you to listen. You thought I was sick." The walls shuddered with her words. The wallpaper peeled, curling back like skin. The floor beneath him pulsed, and David realized with horror that it was wet, sticky. He looked down. His shoes were soaking in dark red liquid seeping up between the floorboards. Blood, no. His breath came in ragged gasps. He backed toward the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. Laura stepped closer. With each movement, her body flickered between the woman he had loved and something else, her jaw unhinged. Her eyes hollow sockets, her arms stretching too long, her fingers curling into claws. "Ah, you let me die," she hissed, her voice rattling inside his skull. "But death didn't take me. The room did. And now, so will you." She lunged. David stumbled back against the wall. Her cold hands closed around his wrists, pinning him in place. Her face hovered inches from his, her eyes swirling black and endless. "Laura, please," he cried, sobbing. "I loved you." Her head cocked again, lips curling into that terrible, stretched smile. "Then stay with me forever." The portrait behind her shifted. David's eyes widened as he saw his own reflection appear within it. His face, terrified, painted onto the canvas beside Laura's distorted grin. The paint bled, dripping down the frame like veins bursting. The smell of iron filled the room. David screamed, thrashing, but her grip was unbreakable. The blood rose higher, flooding the floor, soaking his clothes, pulling him down. His final glimpse was of the portrait, his painted mouth opening in a silent scream as the canvas swallowed him whole. And then silence. When the door creaked open the next morning, the room was empty. The portrait remained. But now, Laura was no longer alone. The chapel had been locked for years, forgotten landmark on the edge of town. It sat slumped at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by wild grass and leaning gravestones that seemed older than the land itself. The steeple, once whitewashed, had dulled to a lifeless gray, and its bell had long since fallen silent. For anyone else, it was just another relic of the past, left to rot. But for Martin, it was the place where his life had begun and ended. He hadn't stepped inside since the funeral. Not for his wife's, but for their wedding 20 years earlier. That day still haunted him. The golden light of late summer, the smell of lilies, her trembling smile as she whispered, "I do." Remembered how her voice wavered with nervous joy, how his hand had tightened on hers as if anchoring her to this world. It had been the happiest moment of his life, the moment he had started lying. His wife Clara was buried now in the cemetery behind the chapel. A sudden illness had taken her, or at least that's what he told everyone. What he didn't admit was the years of betrayal, the secret affair, the lies that corroded their marriage until love was a hollow echo of what it once was. Martin thought that burying her would be the end of it, that her absence would finally silence the vows he'd broken. He was wrong. It began on the anniversary of her death, a whisper through his dreams, so faint he thought it was the wind. For better, for worse. The next night, for richer, for poorer. The third night he woke, drenched in sweat as a voice breathed directly against his ear, "Till death do us part." But Clara was dead, and yet she wasn't gone. He tried ignoring it, drinking himself into heavy sleep. He tried praying, though the words felt empty on his tongue. He even tried sleeping in motels out of town. Still, the whispers followed. Always at night, always in her voice. Finally, one evening, as rain streaked against his windows, the whisper changed. Come back to where it began. The next morning, against every instinct, Martin found himself driving toward the chapel. The road felt narrower than he remembered, the trees leaning in as if trying to block his way. By the time the chapel came into view, clouds had swallowed the sky, casting the building in a permanent dusk. The door groaned when he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and dust. Pews sat in rigid rows, warped from age, and a faint draft whistled through the cracked, stained glass. At the front, the altar stood draped in cobwebs. And yet, beneath the decay, Martin swore he smelled something familiar. Lilies. He stepped inside. Every footfall echoed too loud, bouncing off the rafters as if the chapel itself were alive. His eyes darted to the shadows pooling in the corners, to the pulpit where the pastor once stood, to the aisle where Clara had walked toward him in her white gown. For a moment, he could almost see her. He swallowed hard, forcing himself forward. "Clara?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "If you're here, if this is really you." The air shifted. Cold swept down the aisle like a tide. His breath fogged. And then, a whisper, clear, right behind him, for better for worse. Martin spun. No one. The pews groaned, wood creaking as though weight pressed down on them. Another whisper, this time closer, curling into his ear like a secret, for richer, for poorer. Martin staggered back, nearly tripping. "Stop," he said hoarsely. "You're not real?" But the voice came again, louder, the words dragging like chains. In sickness and in health. The lily scent grew stronger, cloying, suffocating. He pressed a hand over his mouth, gagging, then silence. Martin's heart hammered as he turned in slow circles, eyes darting through the gloom. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. The chapel was dead, until the bell tower groaned above. Single chime rang out, though no one had touched the bell in years. The sound shivered through the building, low and mournful, vibrating in his bones. Martin bolted for the door, shoved it open, stumbling into the gray daylight. But as he reached his car, something caught his eye. Through the chapel's cracked window, a shadow stood at the altar. Tall, draped in white, motionless, watching. Martin froze, every muscle locked in terror, his throat closed, his breath sharp and shallow. The figure didn't move. Then faintly, he heard her voice again. "This time you cannot walk away." Martin didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadow in the chapel window. The white shape hadn't moved, hadn't spoken again, but its stillness was worse than any scream. His mind replayed the words. "This time, you cannot walk away." By dawn, exhaustion dragged at his bones, but fear kept him wired. He told himself it was his imagination, a trick of grief and guilt. Yet, deep down he knew, Clara hadn't left him. She had been waiting, and she wasn't done. The second night, the whispers returned, not in dreams, but in the walls of his house. "I do." The voice floated through the vents, soft, tender. He sat up in bed, clutching the sheets. "Clara." The sound came again, but heavier this time, thick with something darker. "I do." Then it shifted. Bent. Warped. "You will." The words were no longer vows. They were commands. Martin scrambled for the lamp. The bulb flickered once, then burst, plunging the room into darkness. The whisper grew louder, filling every corner. "You will stay. You will pay. Will never leave me again." Martin stumbled out of bed, fumbling for the door. The floorboards groaned as though someone followed. When he looked back, he swore he saw the carpet depress, as if invisible feet pressed into it. He ran into the living room, but the air there was colder, thick with the smell of lilies. The grandfather clock, which hadn't worked in years, suddenly ticked to life. Its pendulum swung violently, the chimes hammering midnight, though the hands pointed at 2 in the morning. And then the whisper rose again, louder than ever, echoing from everywhere at once. "For better, for worse, you will. For richer, for poorer, you will. In sickness and in health, you will." The vows repeated over and over, Clara's voice splintering into screams, into sobs, into laughter that wasn't hers. Martin clutched his ears, sinking to his knees. "Please stop." "I'm sorry, Clara, I'm sorry." The air shifted, and for the first time, the whispers took form. From the hallway, a figure stepped forward, bare feet, pale against the floor. A white dress dragging, shredded at the hem. The veil clung to a face hidden in shadow. Though her eyes burned through the darkness. "Clara." Her voice didn't come from her lips. It rolled through the house, through the walls, through Martin's very bones. "You broke your vows, Martin. You lied. You betrayed me." Martin crawled backward until his spine hit the wall. His chest heaved. "Clara, please, I loved you. I still do. I didn't mean—" Her head tilted. Slowly, too slowly. "You will." The lights in the house flared, then died. Glass shattered. Every picture frame on the walls cracked at once, splintering across his memories. The fireplace roared to life without a match, flames clawing upward, casting monstrous shadows. And in the firelight, Clara's veil shifted. Her mouth curled into something between a smile and a snarl. "If I cannot rest, neither will you." The flames dimmed, leaving only the sound of her vows echoing endlessly. Martin didn't sleep at all that night, sat in the corner until sunrise, the vows still whispering in his ear. By morning, one thing was clear. Clara wasn't just haunting him. She was rewriting their promises, one twisted vow at a time. Martin couldn't take it anymore. 2 nights of Clara's voice crawling through his walls had shredded his nerves. Hadn't slept, he hadn't eaten. His body trembled like a man possessed, and his eyes burned with the red of sleeplessness. But worse than the exhaustion was the knowing. Clara didn't want him in the house. She wanted him back where it all began. At the chapel. So, against every instinct screaming at him to run, he drove there after midnight. The town lay still, dark windows lining the road, but the chapel's steeple stood against the moonlight, like a black dagger stabbed into the sky. When he pushed the heavy wooden doors open, the air hit him thick, damp, cold. He remembered that place filled with flowers and music, Clara's smile radiant as she walked the aisle. But now, the scent was of mildew and rot. The silence was absolute, pressing against his eardrums. He whispered into the stillness. "Clara." The door slammed shut behind him. The sound rattled the old chapel like thunder. He spun around, tugging at the handles, but they wouldn't budge, and then the pews creaked. Not from the wind, not from the wood aging. They groaned as if something heavy pressed against them, as though invisible guests shifted in their seats. Martin's heart hammered. His breath fogged in front of him as the temperature plummeted, and then he heard it. The vow, for better for worse. But this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a chorus. Hundreds of voices, layered and distorted, echoing from every wall. The sound rattled the stained glass windows, which shivered in their frames as if about to burst. Martin staggered down the aisle, his shoes echoing against the stone floor. He couldn't stop himself. Something pulled him forward, a force wrapping around his chest and dragging him closer to the altar. The crucifix above the pulpit shook violently. Candles that had been dead for years sputtered to life, flames burning black instead of gold. Their oily light spilled across the chapel, casting shadows that didn't match his movements. And then she appeared, the Shadow Bride. At the far end of the aisle, where Clara had once stood waiting for him, the air shimmered. Darkness bled into shape. A veil, a dress, a body that wasn't flesh but smoke. Her face was hidden, swallowed by shadow, but her eyes glowed faintly to points of burning white. She began to walk toward him. The pews groaned louder, wood splintering as invisible hands gripped their edges. The hymnals flew open, pages whipping violently as if caught in a storm. The organ, untouched for decades, let out a long, low moan that shook the floor. Martin backed away, his throat dry. No, please. But Clara's vow came again, her voice now echoing inside his skull. For richer, for poorer, you will. He stumbled against a pew. The wood split beneath his weight, a jagged piece slicing his arm. He didn't even feel it. The chapel itself roared around him, alive, awake. The stained glass windows cracked, colors bleeding across the floor like spilled blood. The black-flamed candles bent in unison toward him, as though bowing to Clara's shadow. Still she walked, slow, deliberate, each step echoing like a hammer against his ribs. Martin dropped to his knees, tears streaking his face. Clara, I'm sorry. Please, I'll do anything. Just stop this. Her head tilted beneath the veil. Slowly, too slowly. And then she spoke, not in a whisper, not in a chorus. Her voice filled every inch of the chapel, shaking dust from the rafters. Until death do us part, Martin, was a lie. The words slammed into him like a physical blow. His chest seized. He couldn't breathe. The chapel's doors locked tight, the pews rattled with fury, and the Shadow Bride raised one hand. The black flames flared, swallowing the altar in darkness. And as the last candle died, Martin realized something too late. Clara wasn't just haunting him, she was remarrying him, and this time there would be no escape. Martin's knees buckled as the Shadow Bride advanced, her veil shifting like smoke in a windless room. He tried to crawl backward, hands scraping the cold stone floor, but the chapel wouldn't let him leave. The pews leaned inward, hemming him in. The crucifix above splintered and crashed to the floor behind him, sealing off the aisle. The voices began again.
Ow.
Not whispers this time, not echoes, but a vow recited in 100 different tones. Men, women, children, all repeating the words he once spoke to Clara. For better, for worse. Shadow Bride stopped just inches from him, could feel her presence. Not warmth, not cold, but an emptiness so absolute it hollowed him out. His lungs refused air. His heart thrashed like a trapped bird. For richer, for poorer. Her hand rose, pale and formless, yet sharp at the edges like glass. She placed it on his chest, and Martin screamed as a burning spread through his ribs, branding him from the inside out. He looked down in horror. Her wedding ring, impossibly real, glowing molten red, was searing into his flesh. In sickness and in health, Martin clawed at his chest, but the ring wouldn't move. His skin blistered, split, bled, but the vow etched itself deeper, each word burning into him like scripture carved into stone. Tears blurred his vision. Clara, please. I loved you. I still love you. Her veil lifted, just enough for him to see what waited underneath. Not her face, not anymore. Just a hollow void, a cavern of nothingness. Yet within it he saw every lie he'd told her. Every betrayal, every secret he thought buried. The truth was written there, endless and undeniable. And then she spoke. Until death do us part was never enough. The chapel erupted. Stained glass shattered in unison, raining shards of red and blue fire across the pews. The organ wailed like a beast. The doors flew open, but Martin didn't move. He couldn't. The vow had bound him. The last words fell from Clara's lips, heavier than stone, darker than eternity. Now, you are mine. Forever. The black flames surged, swallowing them both. When dawn came, the chapel stood silent, gutted and burned from within. Locals whispered that the place should be torn down, that no man should step inside again. Yet when one dared to peek, he He swore he saw a figure in the front pew, a man in a suit, eyes hollow, sitting beside a bride in shadow. The vows had been spoken. And in that chapel, they still echo, even now.